Okay, so we're diving deep today into Outlive by Peter Attia. It's a book that has really sparked a lot of conversation about, what it actually means to live a long life, and not just any long life, but a healthy one. We're going way beyond the surface level stuff here, those quick tips and trendy diets.
Exactly. Think of this as a deep dive into Attia's entire framework for longevity, really pulling out the most important insights.
Right, like a master class.
Yeah, exactly. And especially what he calls the four horsemen, which I'm sure a lot of listeners are familiar with:
Heart disease.
heart disease, cancer, neurodegenerative disease, and type 2 diabetes,
Mm.
including metabolic dysfunction. These are, I think, the big players that we need to understand to really think about our long-term health.
Yeah, and Eddie is pretty clear that, the current way we approach medicine isn't always equipped to deal with these slow, gradual developing issues.
Yeah, and that's where what he calls Medicine 3.0 comes in. He doesn't just outline the problem. He offers a different way of approaching health.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really compelling vision for a more proactive, personalized kind of medicine.
Totally. So let's get to it. I guess to give people kind of a roadmap, we're going to start with what are the big lessons, the main takeaways that Addie wants us to kind of have front and center.
Right.
And then we're going to go chapter by chapter systematically through the book. And along the way, pull out real world examples, tactical advice, actionable things that people can take away.
That's good.
So, I mean, I guess one of the first things that Attia really hits you with is this idea that there's a difference between lifespan, like how many years you're alive, versus health span.
Yeah, and I think that's a distinction that's so important but so often missed,
Yeah.
right? People they fixate on just living longer, but they don't necessarily think about how they're going to be living in those later years.
Totally.
And so, he uses, some interesting analogies in the book,
Yeah.
talking about the kind of decline that we see so often where, people are living longer, but they're spending the last 10, 15, 20 years of their lives in a state of decline, really struggling with chronic illnesses.
Yeah. He calls it slow death.
Slow death.
Yeah.
Yeah. As opposed to, what he really advocates for, which is, this idea of fast death, living a long, healthy life and then, relatively quickly reaching the end.
Yeah, compressing that period of decline, that marginal decade, as he calls it.
Right.
So the four horsemen that we talked about, he doesn't just present them as diseases that you might get. He says these are the primary drivers of this prolonged decline in health.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting there is, he really highlights the cumulative nature of them, right? It's not like you suddenly just get heart disease or cancer or Alzheimer's, right?
Yeah.
It's a gradual process that happens over decades, really driven by multiple risk factors.
And he's also pretty frank about, the limitations of medicine as it's practiced today, what he calls medicine 2.0.
Right.
And he uses this really powerful analogy where he says, imagine a building where eggs are constantly falling off the roof.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so medicine 2.0, he says, is fantastic at rushing to catch those eggs after they've fallen. So like, treating someone after a heart attack or, diagnosing cancer after it's already spread. But it's far less effective, he argues, at preventing those eggs from falling in the first place.
And I think that's such a important analogy, and it really gets at the heart of what he's advocating for, which is this shift toward a more preventative approach, right?
Yeah.
Identifying those risk factors early and intervening before, the eggs start falling.
Right. So instead of mopping up the mess, like figure out how to build a better roof.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think another really interesting concept he introduces early on is this idea that, what we consider normal health in society today isn't necessarily optimal. So just because something is common, like, people being overweight or gradually losing energy as they age, doesn't mean that it's how it should be. It doesn't mean that it's something that we should just accept.
Yeah, and I think that's a really powerful message because so often we look around and we see what's happening to people as they age, and we just assume that's normal, right?
Right.
That's just the way it is. But, Attia challenges that assumption and says, look, there's a lot we can do to influence the trajectory of our health as we age.
And so to do that, he outlines these key areas that we need to focus on, these tactical domains, he calls them. And, first and foremost is exercise. But he doesn't just say, go exercise more. He breaks it down into these very specific types.
Yeah, and I think that's where his His framework is really interesting and practical, right? He talks about building strength, he talks about stability, he talks about aerobic efficiency, what he calls zone 2 training, and then also increasing peak aerobic capacity, or VO2 max.
And it's interesting how he connects each one of those back to, not just living longer, but living better.
Yeah, right. So, for example, strength training, right?
Yeah.
He talks about how as we age, we naturally lose muscle mass, and that loss of muscle mass, that sarcopenia, is a major contributor to frailty, falls, and even mortality.
Right.
And so he really emphasizes the importance of maintaining muscle mass as we get older, and strength training is the most effective way to do that.
Right. And I think with stability, he uses the analogy of a car. If you have a car with a really powerful engine, but it has a shaky chassis, it's gonna handle terribly. It's not gonna perform well.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with our bodies. We need that stable foundation in order to, move effectively, to prevent injuries, to, really utilize that strength and that aerobic capacity that we're building.
Yeah, and I think the zone 2 training is particularly interesting because that's really about improving our metabolic health.
Yeah.
Our body's ability to use fuel efficiently, to burn fat for energy. And that has implications not only for our weight and our body composition, but also for things like insulin sensitivity and our risk of developing type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, it's like, he says you can have the biggest engine, but if it can't access the fuel, it's not gonna do you any good.
Right.
And then VO2 max, that's like having, the extra gear that you can tack into when you need it.
Exactly. It's that reserve capacity.
Right.
It's the difference between being able to, run up a flight of stairs or catch your grandkids or, whatever it is that requires that extra burst of energy.
Right. So that's exercise. And then, he moves on to nutrition. And he's very upfront about the fact that this is a minefield. There's so much information, so much contradictory information.
Yeah.
And he kind of takes a very different approach. He says, I'm not going to get into all these arguments about specific diets, keto, paleo, vegan. I'm not interested in that.
Right.
He says, I want to talk about the underlying nutritional biochemistry.
Yeah.
So, how does food interact with our individual biology? And he says the first order principle is energy balance.
Right. And that's often, I think that's often lost in the kind of the noise around nutrition.
Yeah.
People get so caught up in the details of, should I eat this food? Should I not eat this food? They forget that at the end of the day, it really comes down to, are you consuming more energy than you're expending?
Right.
And if you are, that's where the problem lies. And, Attia does a good job, I think, of debunking some of the myths around nutrition. He talks about how nutritional epidemiology, which is a lot of what, a lot of the headlines that we see in the news are based on these observational studies. He talks about how they can be very misleading.
Yeah. It's really hard to control for all the variables.
Exactly. There's so many confounding factors.
Yeah.
People who, engage in certain healthy behaviors, like, let's say, eating more fruits and vegetables, those people are often also engaging in other healthy behaviors.
Right.
They might be exercising more. They might be, not smoking, not drinking. And so it's really hard to tease out, what's the actual factor that's driving the benefit.
So it's correlation, not causation.
Exactly.
Now, he does talk about, certain things that are kind of really, really important no matter what your kind of overall diet is.
Right.
And he talks about protein being, especially as we get older, a real linchpin.
Yeah.
Something that we need to really pay attention to.
Yeah, and I think protein is so often, it's often neglected, especially in the context of aging.
Yeah.
People are so focused on, carbs and fats and all that stuff, but protein is really the building block of our bodies. It's what we need to maintain muscle mass, to repair tissues, to support our immune system. And as we get older, we become less efficient at utilizing protein.
Yeah. So we need to be even more mindful about making sure we're getting enough.
Exactly.
Now, the third pillar that he talks about is sleep. And this is something that he kind of discovered the importance of, the hard way through his own personal experiences,
right.
Going through residency and having these insane hours. And he talks about how profoundly that affected him, both kind of physically and mentally.
Yeah, and I think his personal anecdotes about sleep deprivation are really eye-opening because so often we brush aside sleep as, something that's not that important, something that we can sacrifice.
Yeah.
But his experiences really show just how deeply sleep affects our health, our mood, our cognitive function, everything.
Yeah. He says it's as fundamental as stability is to strength.
Right.
Like you can't build a strong house on a shaky foundation.
Yeah.
And sleep is that foundation for our physical and cognitive health.
And, he also talks about the science of sleep.
Yeah.
He gets into the different stages of sleep, the roles of REM sleep and deep sleep.
Yeah.
And how, as we age, we tend to get less deep sleep, which is when our brains are clearing out metabolic waste products.
Yeah.
And so, that can have implications for things like Alzheimer's disease.
And then finally, he talks about emotional health, which is not something that you typically see as a pillar of, a longevity plan.
Right. And that's where I think Attia really brings a unique perspective to this whole conversation about longevity.
Yeah.
He acknowledges that, look, if you live a long life but you're miserable, what's the point?
Totally.
Right. And he talks about his own personal struggles with anxiety and depression and how he came to realize that, taking care of his mental health was just as important as taking care of his physical health.
Yeah. I think that's so huge.
And he actually talks about some of the things that he did to improve his mental health, things like therapy, mindfulness practices.
Yeah.
And he also talks about the importance of social connection.
Yeah.
How loneliness and isolation are actually major risk factors for premature mortality.
So, we've talked about these four horsemen, but he really breaks it down even further.
Yeah.
And he talks about kind of the two main ways that we deteriorate with age, he says.
Yeah, what he calls the two vectors of deterioration, right?
Right.
Cognitive and physical. And the order isn't predetermined.
Right.
Sometimes, people might experience more physical decline first and then cognitive decline.
Yeah.
For others, it might be the other way around.
Right.
But both are equally important to address.
And so now that we've kind of laid out the big picture, let's dive into some of these chapters in more detail. And, one of the things that he spends a good chunk of the book talking about is this contrast between Medicine 2.0 and his vision for what he calls Medicine 3.0.
Right.
And he even tells this story about, when he was a medical student, an experience he had with this medication called gentamicin in the ICU.
Yeah, and that really was a turning point for him in his thinking about medicine.
Yeah.
He observed this kind of resistance to change, resistance to innovation.
Yeah.
This kind of adherence to established protocols, even when there might be evidence to suggest that a different approach would be better.
So just to give people context, gentamicin, it's an antibiotic.
Yeah.
And he was working in the ICU, and he was seeing these patients that were getting this drug, and he noticed that the dosage that they were getting, based on what he was learning in medical school, seemed way too high. And it was based on their kidney function, and he brought it up to the attending physician, and the attending physician was basically like, no, this is how we do it here. This is the protocol. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
And he was kind of blown away by that.
Right. And I think what's interesting about that story is that it wasn't just about the gentamicin, right?
Yeah.
It was about a larger kind of mindset within medicine, this resistance to questioning the status quo.
Yeah, this unquestioning adherence to dogma.
Right.
So he finishes residency, he's doing surgery, and then he does something completely unexpected. He goes and works in finance and banking.
Yeah.
Which, seems like a total departure from medicine.
It's a total different world.
Yeah, but he actually found that there were some really interesting parallels, particularly around this idea of risk assessment.
Yeah, and I think his time in finance really shaped his thinking about risk in the context of health. He talks about how in medicine we often take this very kind of emotional approach to risk.
Yeah.
We're very focused on immediate threats.
Yeah.
But we're not as good at thinking about long-term risks.
Right. It's like, this patient's in front of me. I need to do X, Y, and Z to, save their life right now.
Right.
And I'm not really thinking about, what are the long-term consequences of this intervention? Or what are the things that I could be doing to prevent this from happening in the first place?
Right. And he contrasts that with, how risk is managed in finance, where, they're very focused on probability, on statistics. They're thinking about long-term trends, trying to anticipate, what's going to happen down the road.
Right. So he brought that thinking back to medicine.
Yeah.
And he also talks about this principle of first do no harm.
Right.
Which, seems so fundamental to medical ethics.
Yeah.
But he argues that in the context of preventing chronic diseases, this principle can actually sometimes be a hindrance.
Yeah. And that's a really, I think, a really provocative argument, right?
Yeah.
Because, first, do no harm is obviously a very important principle. But he's saying that, if we're too focused on avoiding any potential harm, we might actually miss opportunities to intervene early and prevent something much worse from happening down the road.
So it's like, if you have someone who's, pre-diabetic and you're really worried about, the potential side effects of metformin.
Right.
So you decide not to prescribe it.
Right.
Well, 10 years down the road, that person might develop full-blown diabetes, which has a whole host of complications.
Right.
So he's saying we need to kind of expand our thinking about what it means to do no harm.
Yeah, take a more long-term view.
Right. So he goes on to kind of walk us through this evolution of medicine.
Right.
Starting with medicine 1.0, which he calls, the early days of trial and error.
Yeah.
Basically just, trying things and seeing what works.
Yeah, a lot of guesswork.
And then medicine 2.0, which is the advent of evidence-based medicine.
Right.
Which has been a huge advance.
Absolutely.
But he says it has its limitations.
Yeah.
And so his vision for medicine 3.0 is a much more proactive approach that's centered on preventing disease before it takes hold.
Right. And really taking into account individual variability.
Yeah.
The fact that not everyone responds the same way to the same treatment.
Yeah.
And so, medicine 3.0 is about using data, using technology to tailor treatment plans to the individual.
Right. Like he gives the example of setting meteorology to build a better roof.
Yeah.
Instead of just, mopping up the water after it rains.
Right. Understanding the underlying causes, the underlying mechanisms.
Right. And being able to predict what's going to happen and prevent it. So I think one of the most fascinating parts of the book is when he gets into genetics and longevity. And he starts by talking about why it is that natural selection doesn't necessarily favor genes that promote a long and healthy life in our later years.
Right. And that's kind of counterintuitive, right? You would think that, evolution would select for genes that help us live longer. But he explains that from an evolutionary perspective, what matters most is reproductive success.
Yeah.
So genes that help us survive and reproduce during our reproductive years are going to be favored, even if those same genes might have negative consequences later in life.
And he also makes the point that if you look at people who live to be really, really old, centenarians, there's not like a single gene or even a few genes that they all share.
Right.
So it's not like there's like a longevity gene that you can just inherit and live to be 120.
Right.
It's much more complex than that.
It's a combination of multiple genes and also lifestyle factors and probably some luck involved as well.
He does talk about a couple of genes that have been really, strongly associated with longevity and age-related diseases. One of them is the APOE gene, which he explains is involved in cholesterol metabolism and glucose metabolism.
Right.
And it's also a big risk factor for Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, the APOE gene is a really interesting one because there are different variants of it.
Yeah.
And some of those variants are associated with a much higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, while others might actually be protective.
Yeah. So, like, for example, the APOE4 variant
Right.
is the one that's associated with increased risk.
Yeah, it's the highest risk variant. And he talks about how, if you inherit 2 copies of the APOE4 gene, one from each parent, your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease is significantly increased.
Yeah. And then another gene that he talks about is the FOXO3 gene.
Right.
Which is involved in kind of this whole process of cellular maintenance and repair.
Yeah. And it also plays a role in regulating metabolism. And there's some evidence to suggest that certain variants of the FOXO3 gene might be associated with longevity.
Yeah. So he really gets into the weeds on these genes.
Yeah.
And the science is fascinating. But I think, for the average person, the takeaway is, your genes aren't your destiny.
Right.
You can't change your genes, but you can change your lifestyle.
And that's where I think the real power lies.
Yeah.
Right? In understanding how our lifestyle choices interact with our genes.
Right. So he he then moves on to this really interesting chapter where he talks about the science of hunger and health.
Yeah.
And he starts with this intriguing story about the discovery of rapamycin
Oh, yeah.
in the soil of Easter Island.
Yeah, that's a great story.
So just for people who aren't familiar, rapamycin, it's a drug that was originally developed as an immunosuppressant to prevent organ rejection after transplants.
Right.
But it turns out that it also has some pretty remarkable effects on aging.
Yeah, and it's been shown to extend lifespan in a variety of organisms, from yeast to worms to flies to mice.
And he explains how rapamycin works by inhibiting this protein complex called MTR.
Right.
So MTOR, it's kind of like a master regulator of cell growth and metabolism.
Yeah. And it plays a role in a variety of cellular processes.
Yeah.
Including, protein synthesis, autophagy, which is the process of cellular cleanup.
Yeah.
And also the regulation of lifespan.
Right. So inhibiting MTOR, it's like putting the brakes on aging at a cellular level.
Yeah, kind of slowing down that cellular clock.
Now, he compares rapamycin to other supplements that have been, really heavily marketed as having anti-aging benefits, like resveratrol and nicotinamide riboside, or NR.
Right.
And he points out that the evidence for rapamycin is much stronger.
Yeah, I mean, rapamycin has been shown to have pretty consistent life-extending effects in animal models.
Yeah.
Whereas the evidence for resveratrol and NR is much weaker.
Yeah. He says, there's no robust human data showing that these supplements actually prolong lifespan or significantly improve health span.
Right.
So he's basically saying, don't waste your money on these other supplements.
Right, yep.
Focus on the things that have been proven to work.
And I think that's a really important point, because there's so much hype around anti-aging supplements.
Yeah.
And it's easy to get caught up in that.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure we've all been there, seeing these ads and thinking, oh, maybe this is the magic bullet.
Yeah.
But the reality is the science just isn't there to support a lot of these claims.
Yeah.
So he goes on to talk about calorie restriction,
Yeah.
which is the idea that, eating fewer calories can lead to a longer life.
Right.
And he even shares this kind of historical anecdote about Luigi Cornaro, this 16th century Italian guy who reportedly lived to be 100 on a very restricted diet.
Right. And his story, I think, has really captured people's imaginations. This idea that maybe there's something to this calorie restriction thing.
Right. But he points out that, anecdotes aren't evidence.
Right.
And, we need to look at the science. And the science on calorie restriction it's kind of mixed.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely some evidence from animal studies to suggest that it can extend lifespan.
Yeah.
But the results in humans are less clear.
And he talks about how calorie restriction activates another important protein called AMPK,
Right.
which then inhibits MTOR.
Right.
And this leads to a process called autophagy.
Right, which is basically a cellular cleanup process.
Yeah, it's like taking out the trash in your cells.
Yeah, getting rid of damaged components, recycling those components.
Yes, so that the cell can function more efficiently.
Exactly.
Now, this all leads into this really interesting concept of geroprotective drugs, which are medications that are specifically aimed at slowing down the aging process itself.
Yeah, and that's a really a paradigm shift in how we think about aging, right? Instead of waiting for diseases to develop and then treating them, the idea is to actually target the underlying process of aging,
right,
to prevent those diseases from happening in the first place.
And he mentions the TAMI trial,
right,
which is this large-scale clinical trial that's investigating whether metformin, which is a very common diabetes drug, might have broader anti-aging effects.
Right, and that's a really exciting trial. I mean, if metformin is shown to have these geroprotective effects, it could really revolutionize how we approach aging.
Right, because it's a very safe drug.
Yeah, it's been around for a long time. It's very well tolerated.
So let's talk about metabolic dysfunction.
Okay.
Which is a big theme in the book.
Yeah.
And he starts this discussion with this really compelling anecdote about a patient who had a fatty liver.
Yeah.
But didn't drink alcohol, but consumed enormous amounts of soda.
Yeah. That's a really powerful story.
Yeah, it was like, I think it was like 3 liters of soda a day.
Yeah, something like that.
And he points out that, this is actually a really common problem. This non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD.
Right.
It's often associated with obesity.
Yeah.
And also with elevated cholesterol levels.
And it's often silent in the early stages.
Right.
People don't realize they have it until it's progressed to a more serious stage.
Yeah, and it can lead to cirrhosis, liver failure, liver cancer.
Yeah, all kinds of problems.
So he explains that while we often focus on obesity as the central problem,
Yeah.
he actually sees it as one manifestation of a broader underlying metabolic issue.
Right.
And that issue is hyperinsulinemia.
Right. Which is basically just high insulin levels.
Yeah. And so he spends a lot of time explaining how insulin works.
Yeah.
And he emphasizes that its primary role is as a fat storage hormone.
Right. Not a fat utilization hormone.
So when insulin levels are chronically elevated, it leads to more fat storage,
Right.
which then leads to weight gain and all the problems that come with that.
And it's not just about weight gain, right?
Yeah.
He also talks about how insulin is a growth signaling hormone.
Yeah.
And so when insulin levels are high, it can actually promote the growth of things like atherosclerotic plaques in our arteries.
Yeah.
And even cancer cells.
So he really frames hyperinsulinemia as kind of like this master driver of a lot of chronic diseases.
Yeah, it's a central player in the development of metabolic dysfunction, which then has all these downstream consequences.
So he then traces the historical rise in the prevalence of type 2 diabetes, and he really connects it to the changes in our diet.
Yeah.
You know, the increase in processed foods,
Right.
refined carbohydrates,
Yeah.
sugar.
Yeah.